Coming out on this typical Cleveland spring day to the Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group. One more day until St. Patrick's Day, and as far as I'm concerned, we're in spring. We're almost there. But I appreciate you all coming out here, especially Case Law School, who is our co-presenter of this Greater Cleveland International Lawyers Group seminar. Sent a number of students, and we appreciate their support of this organization. Just a few things. If you're not a member and you'd like to become a member, we'd certainly appreciate it. That is what we do here, is we just get a bunch of people of same interest together as members and put on presentations during the year. There's membership forms out in the front desk, and if you could pick one up on the way out, that would be great. It also has our website on it, so you can find out what our speakers are for the rest of the year and next year. And in fact, Michael Scharf is going to introduce today's speaker, but I just wanted to mention next month, April 20th, it'll be very warm. Simon Potter from the Ogilvy Renault firm in Montreal, Canada, who was he was a former president of the Canadian Bar Association, is scheduled to come here to Cleveland and talk on NAFTA, a Canadian perspective. And that will be sponsored by the Rosner and Associates firm here in Cleveland, and we hope you can all attend that presentation. So, and one other thing, you noticed that these handouts are at the front. I hope you pick one up. It was very nice of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York, to actually come here today. We're very happy. If you think it was tough coming from the east side or the west side, they came from Jamestown, New York, to be here today, and they provided us copies of these. Lecture series notes that Henry King actually gave recently out of the Robert H. Jackson Center. So we're very happy to have them here and appreciate them bringing this handout for us. That is it, and let me introduce Michael Scharf, who's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you for coming.
All right, I'm Michael Scharf. I am the director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center at Case Western Reserve. And the former director, my predecessor, who is now the associate dean, is someone who you're all familiar with, and he's here as well, Hiram Chodash. And our dean of our law school wanted to be here but wasn't able to make it. But we're real excited to be partnering on this huge event this afternoon, and I'll get to that in a second. But let me thank Chris and Henry for doing your part to make this work out, and also Alice Simon and Nancy Canner and others who worked so hard on the logistics of today's event. As Chris mentioned, there are handouts of a variety of kinds, some of which are about the International Law Center at Case. Also, there are handouts of UN Security Council resolutions that Nicolas Rostow will be referring to today. So especially you students in international organizations and other classes, you may want to pick that up on the way out. One other thing that's hot off the press is a postcard that looks like this that advertises the advent of the Case Law School International Humanitarian Law Portal. This is a website for how to research war crimes. I think you all from the Jackson Center will find that very useful. And then without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Nicolas Rostow. Currently, he is the Chief Counsel to the United States Mission to the United Nations. He has held a number of very high-profile and important jobs in the U.S. government. When I met him 15 years ago, I got a call when I was working in the State Department from a very low and intimidating-sounding officer who was the Chief Counsel of the National Security Council. And he said, Michael Scharf says, I understand you're counsel to the Counterterrorism Bureau, and he says, we've got a terrorist situation, and I would like to enlist your work on a very interesting alternative response. And what happened, some of you will remember this occasion, was that there had been an attack on the Israeli coast by a fleet of little vessels, Zodiac boats, and they disappeared after the attack into the sea. And the United States had tracked them onto a huge ship called the Tiny Star, which was registered to Libya and was sailing to the port of Piraeus, Greece. And of course, DOD and FBI had their own ideas of how to deal with this. And Nick said, why don't we use the rule of law in this case and see what we can do? Well, the Tiny Star was tied up in legal maneuvers by myself and Nick for so long that it's still rusting in the port of Piraeus. And the terrorists paid a price. And the rule of law was able to be utilized instead of the rule of force in that occasion successfully. Nick has also been counsel to the Senate Intelligence Committee. He's been a law professor at the University of Tulsa, and he is just one of the bright lights in the field of international law and in the U.S. government. It makes me feel good to know someone like Nick is out there fighting the good fight. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nick Rostow. Some souvenir gifts for you. The one I'll pull out. This is a little sweatshirt from the Cox Center. Nick's on his way to Florida for a little R after this, so you can use this when you're playing tennis. All right, good luck with your speech. And he'll speak for about a half hour, and then we'll have question and answer from the audience.
Well, thank you, Michael. That's a very kind, overly kind introduction. And I'm reminded of Dr. Johnson's famous remark that authors of lapidary inscriptions are not under oath. So you should not take the word that Michael said as truth. It just simply isn't. It's a great honor to be here and a great pleasure, I must say. I haven't been in Cleveland in a decade, and that's my misfortune. And my subject today is law and politics at the United Nations. And I'm going to take up three otherwise disparate subjects: Iraq, terrorism, and the pursuit of justice at the UN, and try and knit them together in some coherent fashion. The Iraq crisis, which has been going on at least since 1979, has been about law and order, as well as politics, oil, and power. Terrorism is attacked through law, although it principally is a political instrument as well as a crime. The United Nations spends huge resources in time, money, and energy on justice. We can't escape politics, and we can't always achieve the law, but we have to strive for it. That has been the continuing lesson of World War II, out of which emerged the international order in which we operate. Let me begin, however, with some background. And when discussing the United Nations, it is particularly important and often difficult to keep straight which United Nations one means at any particular time. It is a mistake to think of the UN as an entity distinct from its members. The UN Charter set out the fundamental rules for international relations among independent states. It also created the United Nations Organization, to which those same states agreed to delegate certain powers without thereby creating a world government. And the organization itself consists in turn of bodies like the Security Council and the General Assembly, of representatives of states, and then a bureaucracy, the Secretariat, presided over by the Secretary General, and over the years since 1945, a large number of UN agencies and organizations, some consisting of representatives of states, some not. Some, like the World Food Program, provide sustenance to entire societies. So when one speaks of the United Nations, it's never quite clear to me which UN one means. The Secretariat claims to control the flag, however, which is an important point. The structure set out in the Charter reflected an experience, mostly negative, with the League of Nations. And whereas the League was only usable to marshal participants in police actions if everyone in the League Council agreed, the UN Charter gave the now 15-member Security Council not only primary responsibility for maintaining peace, but also the ability to act by majority, provided the permanent members do not exercise their vetoes. The Security Council has the authority to take decisions which, under the Charter, member states agree to carry out. This power is not trivial, and it means that not all resolutions, or even parts of resolutions, have the same legal significance. The veto has always been and remains controversial. It was and remains the price of having a UN forum capable of acting with executive authority. The General Assembly consists of all the member states. Its principal function is to provide a forum in which all states have equal votes and equal opportunity to be heard. General Assembly resolutions can cover as many subjects as members want, and the General Assembly has the power of the purse. Beyond that, General Assembly resolutions mainly are recommendations to members or the Secretariat or statements about issues. Sometimes such resolutions can frame a political question. Sometimes they are taken as evidence of what all states agree the international law on a particular subject is or should be. And sometimes they can introduce new elements into a debate, as everyone expects will happen as a result of the request to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on legal consequences of the Israeli security fence. The General Assembly made the request, although it already had stated its view that the fence violates international law. American foreign policy is subject to unique challenges at the United Nations. The effort required to advance positions within an institution comprising 191 nations inevitably generates undertows that threaten to sweep you where you do not necessarily want to go. The challenge is to establish and stick to priorities and to know when an issue is best dealt with outside the UN context altogether. The fact that the United States can even think about the United Nations in such terms makes it special among the world's powers. At this historical moment, U.S. power makes the United States indispensable as the marginal extra for successful multilateral efforts. Most UN national interests can be advanced only with the cooperation of other countries. This is especially true in the case of health, environmental, social, and economic areas. It also can be true where our vital national interests are at stake. But we shall not and we cannot make the defense of our vital national interests depend on votes at the United Nations. This is not hegemony, it is the legitimate exercise of national sovereignty perfectly in line with the UN Charter itself. This background informs the balance of my remarks on Iraq, terrorism, and the pursuit of international justice at the UN. The Iraq problem has many dimensions. It can be looked at as an example of what happens when the international community does not line up against aggression. Surely, the Iran-Iraq war would not have lasted a decade if the community could have united on it. The Iraq issue can be looked at as an example of the inability of the UN Security Council to be effective when the permanent members disagree. That is part of the story of the 1990s and perhaps even of 2002-2003. And it can be examined as an example of a UN glass half full. The Security Council was able to address the Iraq crisis, but proved unable to bring it to an end. The inadequacy of the UN Security Council reflects the divisions among its members, not an inherent flaw in the idea of the Security Council as a forum with power. I would like now to address the Iraq problem of the past year and a half. It is, after all, about 18 months since President Bush called on the UN Security Council to enforce its resolutions against Iraq. I shall take a moment to set out the administration's view as to the lawfulness of the Iraq campaign under UN Security Council resolutions. This subject is important and has been controversial. And then I shall say a few words about where we are headed on Iraq at the UN. The first point to make is that the Security Council resolutions on Iraq were not ordinary resolutions. They imposed and repeatedly affirmed binding legal obligations on Iraq. In this respect, the Iraq resolutions are different from most resolutions on the Arab-Israeli conflict, for example, or other subjects. For example, the resolutions that provide an agreed framework for the Arab-Israeli peace are not mandatory in their language. They affirm or call on, they do not decide, and they therefore are not decisions members of the UN agree to carry out. The Iraq problem of the last year cannot be understood without recalling Iraq's unprovoked attack on Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990. On August 2nd, the UN Security Council condemned the invasion, and after several months of unsuccessful diplomacy backed by sanctions, in November of 1990, the Security Council adopted Resolution 678. And I apologize in advance, this is going to be a little bit of numerology here, but it's important. Resolution 678 authorized the use of force after January 15, 1991, if Iraq did not withdraw from Kuwait. The resolution authorized member states cooperating with the government of Kuwait to use all necessary means to uphold and implement Resolution 660, the condemnation of the invasion and the demand that Iraq immediately withdraw, and all subsequent relevant resolutions, and to restore international peace and security in the area. Operation Desert Storm, the 1991 Gulf War to eject Iraq from Kuwait, began on January 16, 1991, by decision of the U.S.-led coalition, not of the Security Council. It ended with a ceasefire, also by decision of the U.S.-led coalition. And then, on April 3rd, the Council adopted Resolution 687, codifying that ceasefire and imposing additional obligations on Iraq, bearing in mind the goal of securing international peace and security in the area. In order to obtain a ceasefire, Iraq formally accepted the terms of Resolution 687. Resolution 687 set forth the conditions for fulfilling the terms of Resolution 678, the authorization to use force, but did not rescind or provide for the termination of that authorization. Resolution 687 required Iraq to renounce all programs for developing nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons, and all missiles with a range greater than 150 kilometers, among other things. In addition, it created an international inspection regime to monitor compliance. And from April 1991 until March last year, the Security Council engaged in a tug-of-war with Iraq to obtain compliance. The Security Council never found that Iraq had met its obligations, or that the authorization to use force approved in 1990 was no longer in effect, or even that the war commenced by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 had ended. This was because Iraq refused to carry out the terms of the ceasefire as set out in Resolution 687. The refusal was apparent within 1 month of the resolution's adoption and caused the Security Council to find that Iraq was in, quote, material breach of the resolution, that is, of the conditions of the 1991 ceasefire. The term material breach was derived from the 1961 Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. A material breach is a repudiation of the agreement, or a violation of a provision or term essential to the accomplishment of the object or purpose of the agreement. Material breach of an international agreement by one of the parties entitles the other to invoke the breach as a ground for terminating or suspending the agreement in whole or in part. Iraq failed to fulfill the essential terms of the ceasefire agreement by submitting inaccurate and incomplete declarations of its holdings of prohibited weapons, weapons systems, and support structures, concealing prohibited weapons and weapons programs, and obstructing the inspection regime designed to monitor and verify Iraqi compliance. The United States and the United Kingdom and others understood the finding of material breach to mean that the use of force was again permitted to compel Iraq to comply with its obligations. This story is significant for what happened in 2002 and 2003. On November 8, 2002, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1441. It recognized, quote, the threat Iraq's non-compliance with Council resolutions and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and long-range missiles poses to international peace and security. It found that Iraq has been and remains in material breach of its obligations under relevant resolutions, including Resolution 687 of 1991, over 11 years earlier. As we have seen, these words carry great legal significance. The political significance remained to be seen. It was the 9th such finding by the Security Council since the end of the 1991 Gulf War. And I might add that one of the other pieces of significance, although not very great, was that it caused me to give up my crystal ball, since I predicted that the Security Council, having adopted 1441, would not then be able to turn its back on it. But hey. This 9th conclusion about material breach did not mean that the Council had found Iraq in breach only 9 times. From 1993 to the end of 2002, the Council also concluded 3 times that Iraq was in flagrant violation of its obligations. 12 times that Iraq was not complying, once that Iraq was in clear-cut defiance, 3 times that Iraq committed a clear violation, twice that its violations were clear and flagrant, and once that Iraq was in gross violation of 687. If you add in the 9 findings of material breach, you have 40 occasions in which the Council wagged its finger at a non-compliant Iraq. Resolution 1441 gave Iraq a final opportunity to correct its material breach and threatened serious consequences if it did not do so. Everyone understood serious consequences to be the use of force. It was the 12th Security Council threat of serious consequences since the ceasefire of 1991 in response to Iraq's persistent non-compliance with essential terms of that resolution that codified the ceasefire, 687. While some have argued that only the Security Council ought to determine when, after the ceasefire of 1991, it is permitted to invoke the authorization to use force in Resolution 678, the United States and others have never shared that opinion. Rather, they have consistently argued that because Iraq was not fulfilling the terms of the ceasefire, Resolution 687, the authorization to use force remained in effect without requiring subsequent Security Council affirmation of this fact. Iraq's final opportunity required both an accurate declaration of its weapons and weapons programs and full cooperation with UN inspectors. Iraq failed both tests, and this conclusion is inescapable from reading the reports of UN inspectors. Of course, as we all know, Security Council members did not agree about what to do next. To that extent, the unanimity of the vote for Resolution 1441 disguised disunity. Resolution 1441 embodied a compromise between those governments that did not want to require a second Security Council resolution decision with respect to the use of force and those that did. And Resolution 1441 required the Council to meet to consider the situation and the need for full compliance with all the relevant Security Council resolutions in order to secure international peace and security. And between November 8, 2002 and March 19, 2003, the Security Council met some 47 times on Iraq. Of course, the difference between 2002 and 2003 and the prior decade was September 11, 2001. The margin of error had disappeared. The margin for error had disappeared. And since the demise of Saddam Hussein, the Security Council has come together twice on Iraq and its future. Despite disagreement over the way the Iraq situation unfolded, everyone could unite on the need to help the people of Iraq take control of their destiny and, with international help, establish a society and government operating according to law. The 2 Security Council resolutions adopted, 1483 and 1511, which are in your packet, endorse this outcome and give the United Nations Secretariat a robust mandate to help achieve it. Now we all face the fact that a new government of Iraq will take charge on July 1. This fact requires that we all join hands again to help make it a success. The people of Iraq deserve no less. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 were transforming events for the United States, Iraq, and also for the United Nations. As we have seen, they impelled decisions to enforce the law of Security Council resolutions on Iraq. They also brought about profound change in the way the United Nations approaches terrorism. Profound change, but not a complete revolution. And perhaps the terrorist attacks of March 11th in Madrid will bring about a revolution, but that would involve changing UN bureaucratic priorities. The change wrought by September 11th alone has had legal and practical significance. Prior to September 11th, the United Nations addressed terrorism through the work of the General Assembly's Legal Committee. It provided the forum for negotiating a series of conventions addressing particular terrorist acts. The conventions did not define terrorism itself. The General Assembly has not been able to agree on a definition of terrorism since taking up the question over 30 years ago. The reason for the failure is simple. Too many governments are not willing to prohibit terrorism in all circumstances. The terrorist attacks of September 11, however, brought the General Assembly closer to agreement than ever before, but it could not bring it to cross the last bridge. Those attacks did, however, drive the Security Council to take center stage on terrorism at the United Nations. It has done so in two ways. First, even after the fall of the Taliban in Afghanistan, it has maintained sanctions against al-Qaeda and the Taliban wherever they may be found. That is, they have required countries to criminalize their behavior and try to arrest and bring to justice members of the Taliban and al-Qaeda. It's not quite sanctions, but it's called sanctions. This deterritorialization of sanctions was a first for the Council. Second, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1373. In its reach and use of the power to obligate states, Resolution 1373 has no parallel in the canon of Security Council resolutions. Its mandatory provisions require states to prohibit all forms of active and passive assistance to terrorism. They spell out in detail what this requirement means in terms of financing and financial transactions, border controls, arms trafficking, and transit. The terms are taken in part from the Convention Against Terrorist-Related Financing. And the resolution, therefore, resembles a multilateral treaty much more than a typical Security Council resolution. It also does not define terrorism, because no one could agree on how to define terrorism. And while on paper the Security Council has the power to impose such obligations on all states, making such commands effective is another matter. The Council has achieved a high level of acceptance of this resolution by virtue of the work of the Security Council Committee established to monitor implementation, the Counterterrorism Committee. And as an aside, I might say I'm the U.S. representative on the committee. The Counterterrorism Committee has become the center of a worldwide effort to identify countries' needs in the area of capability to fight terrorism and to bring help to meet those needs. It has put counterterrorism on the agenda of every international organization and become the coordinating body for those organizations. Its focus remains on building capabilities, capacity building in the language of the committee. Its work, therefore, is not particularly glamorous. Indeed, there's never been a leak, as far as I know, because it really isn't glamorous. The hope is that it can narrow the space in which terrorists operate. The Counterterrorism Committee's success has reflected the international community's acceptance of its work and of Resolution 1373 itself. And while the ferocity of terrorism has provided an important catalyst, perhaps as important has been the uniquely transparent way in which the Counterterrorism Committee works. Normally, the Security Council's work takes place behind closed doors. This fact does not mean people don't know what is going on. There are, after all, 15 countries represented on the Security Council, and representatives of all relevant secretariat offices attend all meetings. But UN members more broadly depend on their own sources and contacts in order to know what is happening in detail. Not so the Counterterrorism Committee. From the moment the committee was established in October 2001, its chairmen have periodically briefed UN members on the committee's work. The goal has been to persuade member states that the committee was really their committee, doing work they thought was in their interest. And so far, the method has worked, and the counterterrorism decisions of the 15 members of the Security Council have been supported. The legal significance of this fact is considerable. One hears grumbles from time to time that the Security Council is doing too much and overstepping its bounds. This complaint was heard right after the Cold War, when the Council became capable of action on a wide front. It revives from time to time when the Council addresses interstitial issues. And we will doubtless hear it again in connection with efforts to address the danger that non-state actors might obtain weapons of mass destruction, a gap in existing treaty regimes. The efforts on Iraq and terrorism can be seen as fitting into the larger subject of transitional justice debated at the United Nations. Transitional justice can involve efforts to create the rule of law in war-torn societies. It also can involve efforts to transform dictatorships into democracies. UN discussion has resulted in acceptance of the proposition that each situation requires an approach tailored to it. Such transformations involve important and complicated political and legal issues and questions. They do not necessarily fit comfortably together. Interest in this subject has been driven by the conflicts in the Great Lakes region of Africa, Congo, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Sudan, and other places. The subject is important to the former Yugoslavia, parts of the former Soviet Union, East Timor, and Iraq and Afghanistan as well. Societies in conflict or transition from one condition to another raise multifaceted political, social, economic, and legal questions that do not lend themselves to simple solutions. And at the United Nations, the Security Council's peacekeeping operations increasingly need to be sensitive to the issues and capable of addressing them. In a substantial number of situations, the claims of justice and the claims of peace, progress, and prosperity need to be balanced. Often the people or groups who must be brought into a political process are accused of engaging in criminal activity, and sometimes grotesque criminal activity. The Secretary General has put the problem under a lens. On September 24th last year, he told the Security Council, quote, "In addressing these issues of transitional justice, sensitive questions are involved, questions of sovereignty, tradition, security, justice, and reconciliation. The task is not simply technically difficult, it is politically delicate. It requires us to facilitate the national formulation and implementation of an agenda to address these issues, to cultivate the political will and leadership for that task, and to build a wide constituency for the process. We must take a comprehensive approach to justice and the rule of law. It should encompass the entire criminal justice chain, not just police, but lawyers, prosecutors, judges, and prison officers, as well as many issues beyond the criminal justice system." Kofi Annan then addressed the question of past crimes and victims of past crimes. Ending the climate of impunity, he said, is vital to restoring public confidence and building international support to implement peace agreements. At the same time, we should remember that the process of achieving justice may take many years, and it must not come at the expense of the more immediate need to establish the rule of law on the ground. He noted that a variety of mechanisms, including truth commissions and other devices, had helped countries move ahead. At times, he said, the goals of justice and reconciliation compete with each other. Each society needs to form a view about how to strike the right balance between them. He then urged that war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, for example, not be the subject of amnesties. Since 1993, the United Nations has seen bringing the worst offenders to justice as essential. Thus, in 1993, the Security Council established a special international tribunal with jurisdiction over crimes in the former Yugoslavia. It established a similar tribunal with jurisdiction over the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, and laid the basis for the establishment of a Sierra Leone court with UN assistance. The courthouse for this institution was dedicated last week. The General Assembly has pressed for a UN-supported chamber in Cambodia to try those Khmer leaders said to be responsible for the killing fields of the mid-1970s. And the United States has been a strong supporter of each of these efforts. At the same time, each society has to find its own way. Bringing the worst offenders to justice can be necessary to launching a country into a new era of peace and prosperity in which the rule of law plays an indispensable role. One should not forget, however, that some countries have made this transition without benefit of international trials or even truth and reconciliation commissions. Indeed, the most important event of my lifetime, the collapse of the Soviet Union, took place without benefit of these institutions. And building institutions that are necessary to developing and enforcing the rule of law is the work of many hands. And I'm glad to say Mike Scharf leads one of the institutions that provides a helping hand right here. This work is important to the process of modernization and national reconciliation, whatever the process may turn out to be. The world is not so simple that we can take a one-size-fits-all approach. At the same time, nuclear and other horrific weapons, terrorism and other phenomena exert enormous pressure in the direction of strengthening the rule of law internationally because there is no alternative. Let me conclude where I began with a reflection on the United States and the United Nations. It really is a comment on the United States and the world. As one commentator has written, quote, "We are an island off the great continent of Eurasia. This means that we are the natural enemy of powers that seek hegemony in Europe or Asia, the natural friend of smaller countries who want no external hegemony, including that of America. It is for that reason that a strong United States is needed in the world, not as the last remaining superpower, but as the critical margin required to make any international collaborative effort succeed. That function requires an ability to listen as well as to lay down the law. The objective is to create a partnership of many nations, large and small, in a world where power is diffused. In time, another major state may emerge as a critical margin, but now and for the foreseeable future, there is no one to take America's place." Unquote. Thank you very much.
I don't think we should give up on defining terrorism. You know, in the Rome Treaty, you got war crimes, you got genocide, and crimes against humanity. Able to define it, or is it just the political people who say one man's patriot is another one country's patriots or another country's terrorists? I want to get your comments. You're right at the forefront, and do we just stop, forget about it, or we're all talking about against terrorism, but we haven't defined it.
Well, as I'm prepared to say that what we regard as terrorist attacks in Israel or India or Sri Lanka are terrorist attacks. And therefore, there's been no agreement on a definition. So,
Well, how do we fight it? Can we fight it effectively?
well, I think that a lot of useful work is being done without a definition. First of all, a lot of the world shares a view that terrorism is intolerable per se. And even those states that do not share this view don't like to be the victims of terrorism, and so they are prepared to strengthen their capability to fight terrorism, and that's at least partly helpful, even if we would disagree about who the main perpetrators are. But it's a problem. My view is that when the world agrees on a definition of terrorism, it will no longer be necessary to have one. Okay. No other questions?
Oh, no, there's questions.
Yeah. Well, there's a general feeling that, on part of many people, with regard to the invasion of Iraq, that we were overly impatient in getting into Iraq. If we'd waited a little longer, we might have got more support. Now, I'd like to get your point of view on that. One problem you have sometimes is, sometimes people mention the doctrine of preemption, and I'm concerned that we differentiate that from the Nuremberg concept of aggressive war. So I'd like to get your thinking on that, because I think the doctrine of preemption has been used by officials of the government.
Well, first on the question of the timing of the military campaign, I really do not think that waiting another year or 6 months was going to make any difference. I think that Saddam played the United Nations brilliantly, and he took advantage of every delay and every sign of division and every sign of weakness. And so I don't think that it would have made any difference in terms of knowing satisfactorily what he was up to. And I think that while from my point of view, it's a little unfortunate that the K report has drawn attention to one small slice of it, because there's an awful lot in it about activity that was prohibited and extremely dangerous. And indeed, the best of the UN, and that's not my judgment, that's the judgment of a former British ambassador to the UN, head of an inspection team, the Swede Rolf Ekéus, wrote in the Washington Post last June, saying that Saddam's object was to have the capability to bring to the battlefield, or whatever other field he wanted, nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons at the time of his choosing. And he said the only way to put a stop to that was the way we had to do it, and after September 11th, it was just impossible to take the risk. A friend of mine who's a great international lawyer used to say that when the national strategy paper used the word preemption, he wished they'd used the word interception in order to preempt problems. And I think that that's not a legal document, and I've always thought the only way you can apply such an idea is consistent with the traditional law of self-defense, known as anticipatory self-defense, that does not require that you wait for Pearl Harbor to go after your attacker, but it does require that you have very, very good intelligence, and that the problem we now face, where we know we can be hit out of the blue with no warning. The Spanish now know it. We found out September 11th. A lot of other countries have found out. Means that the assessment of risk becomes a much more difficult and refined art. And situations that would be tolerable before September 11th, or you bet that they would come out all right, you just cannot do that. Prime Minister Blair gave really an extraordinary speech on this subject last Friday, March 5th, which I commend to all of you. It's available on the ukun.org website, the full text. And that's the point he was making, which is that there's just, the heads of government don't have the luxury of taking gambles at this moment, given what's happened. That's a luxury, and they also have another problem. They have to live with their decisions, which their advisors don't usually have to. They can always say, "Sorry, boss, I was wrong. I resign." Sir.
With the amount of explosives put on that train in Spain, and finding that bag of explosives with the cell phone inside, I'm amazed we haven't figured out who put them there, and finding out who they are.
Well, I'm very far removed from the people who know what we know and what we don't know. So I share your interest in the subject, but I can't shed any light on it.
Figure out where they came from.
Nick, what do you think the key lessons are from our efforts thus far on transitional justice, to take forward to Iraq and other countries, and with particular attention to the UN's involvement?
Well, I think that I don't know if you all could hear it. It's an excellent question about lessons learned on
Did you all hear it in the back?
transitional justice. First of all, what we're really talking about is reconstituting or constituting in the first instance societies that can operate according to the rule of law. It requires, in many cases, a lot of training and a lot of effort. Liberia is a kind of tabula rasa in this area. And they're making a big effort on this front. In effect, the UN governor of Liberia is very conscious of the need to build a society that can operate according to the rule of law in the absence of one. I think it's one has to be very long-term about it. One has to enlist a lot of people in this from different societies as well as from the society in question and from cultures that have an affinity to the society in question. And I think one needs to be transparent about it, because in every effort the United Nations has taken, a role in that I know of, there have been terrible allegations of corruption and mismanagement. And I don't think there's enough transparency about those operations. That is, member state governments know something about them, but there isn't enough, even they don't know a great deal, and there isn't a lot of transparency. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but the main thing is it's a long process. And it is, what we're looking at really is a form of multilateral trusteeship. In a way, decolonization failed in a lot of countries, and the international community is trying to help those societies make progress toward the goal they always had to begin with. So.
National security is obviously an excellent concern and something that we are actively addressing, but how do you address the other front, which is the PR front? Many of the Muslim nations and other places around the world that just increasingly we've seen have a disdain for the U.S. And the argument is that, today's 10-year-olds are tomorrow's suicide bombers. How do you confront that, but still keep national security as a main concern?
Well, I think it's actually quite interesting, the impact of President Bush's speech about democracy in the Arab world, for example, has stirred up a hornet's nest of debate on that subject. There's more talk about it in the Arab world than there's been ever before. I don't think there's an easy answer to the problem of anger in the Islamic world, dislike of the United States. I think we have to do more about what people teach in schools. It's really terrible what goes on in a lot of schools. And I think the Islamic world has got to face the music on terrorism. It will have a problem as long as it doesn't take action, which every other country that's had a terrorist problem has taken action to prohibit it in all circumstances and go after the perpetrators and not tolerate it. And until they do that, there's going to be a difficulty that in much of the world will see terrorism as primarily Islamic, and that will keep the stoking the flames in Islamic societies. I think they also have to open up. I had a colleague who was asked by a UN official what he thought the sources of terrorism were, and he said, well, there were these dictatorial, inflexible societies. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, if you weren't in the right family, you had a choice of going to America or becoming a radical. It wasn't exactly what the UN official wanted to hear, but there's a lot in it. Sir?
Probably two questions, but since you mentioned this issue and your answer, don't we have a good example of a Muslim country already abiding by and working very hard to set the example for the rule of law in the country of Turkey, and how many people are really familiar with how well they have done. I mean, it goes all the way back to Ataturk in the 20s, but and they could, in my opinion, if you want to comment, I would appreciate it. They might be a country that can help lead the way for other countries to follow the example that they set.
Well, I mean, Turkey is an example of a Islamic state that absolutely is a rule of law society. It's one of the reasons we've been urging the European Union to accept Turkey as a member. We think that would be good for Europe and good for the world. The Turks have, of course, their own legacies with the Middle East that has not always been a happy one. So there are some societies have longer memories than others, and but it is a Muslim country that has been a Western democracy for much of the last 80 years, and a staunch ally, and it's very important that it remain so and be an example.
What's your view of the recent change in policy in Libya, and what do you think are the key events that led to that change in policy in terms of opening themselves up to the inspections?
Well, I think a combination of things. I think Gaddafi's gotten older. You know, being a gangster is a young man's sport. And I think sanctions took their toll. And I think the example of Afghanistan and Iraq was a signal that certain things were not going to be tolerated anymore. I think it's an extremely interesting development. It shows one of the risks of introducing too much law in foreign policy, in my view. If Gaddafi had been indicted, for example, for blowing up Pan Am 103 or the French airplane in Africa that blew up, we wouldn't have had the ability to engage with him on this subject because there'd be an indictment hanging over his head. So one has to be careful about being too pure in some of these areas. Yes, sir.
Again?
Yeah, why not?
My first question was going to be Resolution 687. Are you saying precisely that that was still in effect before we began to negotiate with setting up a coalition or engaging in conversation with other members of the United Nations to come up with 1441?
Absolutely.
Before we went.
Absolutely.
It was still open and still alive.
Absolutely. Our entire, in my view, and this is where I disagree with the successive administrations, actually going back to the first Bush administration, the authorization to use force in 678 provided the main legal authority for the no-fly zones and enforcing the no-fly zones, which involved hundreds of thousands of air sorties over Iraq in the last 12 years. And 687, which was the ceasefire, absolutely was the key to the whole thing. That set out the terms for restoring peace and stability in the region and welcoming Iraq back into the international community. And if Saddam had accepted the outcome of the 1991 war, we wouldn't be where we are today, and we wouldn't have been where we've been in the last decade. Yes, sir.
Are you worried that the elections in Spain are going to set a bad precedent so closely on the heels of the terrorist attack?
Well, you know, my employment depends on what happens in November, so I think I will duck that question. Sir.
Actually, that was kind of my question. How independent are you of the administration?
I am not. I was appointed by John Negroponte, he was appointed by Colin Powell and the president, and so I'm a political appointee. There are only 4 of us, I think, at the UN, U.S. mission. Sir?
What is the preferred U.S. definition of terrorism, and does it endorse the concept of state terrorism in any sense?
I think there are 32 legal definitions in the U.S. Code on of terrorism. I think basically we would regard an attack on civilians for political purpose, causing widespread, really is essentially the goal being to cause as much damage as possible. I don't have a precise definition in my head. We think that states can support and have supported terrorists. It's a very effective way to keep your hands clean. I've always thought that Osama bin Laden, for example, was a perfect instrument for certain countries because they could dump money in a Swiss account and never have to talk to him because he wanted to do it anyway. And we also are, however, very concerned about efforts to say that when armies or regular soldiers commit war crimes, say, or violate the laws of war, that's terrorism, which is what a lot of people want in the definition of the UN because they can finger the Israelis that way, or the Indians. Those are the two favorite whipping boys at the moment.
You bring up a question to the table with your comment about crooks. Switzerland is probably the largest home base for the crooks in the world with their secret accounts. Nobody in this room, of course, but what position has Switzerland taken in this regard, and is there any cooperation whatsoever with tracing terrorists to some of those secret accounts?
I think the Swiss have been cooperative. I think they've changed their banking laws substantially after the 1990s, but and they do support the work of the Counterterrorism Committee, and they're part of the larger group of countries that offers assistance to other countries trying to improve their counterterrorist capabilities. And I am sure that they cooperate to the extent their law allows with our counterterrorists in Washington. But beyond that, I really don't know. There was a question.
One last question.
There was a question in the back, so maybe two more questions. Mike.
What do you think about the desirability or the foreseeability of the implementation of UN Charter Article 43?
Don't hold your breath.
Of a multinational military force to do perhaps what we did in Iraq last year?
Michael, do you want to add your question to that one?
No, I didn't have a question. I was just saying we had time for
Oh, okay.
one
All right.
question.
Article 43 of the Charter is a provision which has never been made operational, which would look to member states designating forces that would be available to the United Nations on call to undertake things like the Iraq operation. And I think we're more likely to see regional organizations or sub-regional organizations like, say, the OAS or the ECOWAS in Africa, which has been doing a lot of regional peacekeeping, developing a kind of multinational capability before we will see the UN doing it. Partly this is because most contributors to UN peacekeeping operations at the moment don't like their forces to get into trouble. They do it mainly because they're well paid, and so it's a revenue source. But whenever there's been a really dangerous mission, it's been difficult for the UN to get people to meet or send enough troops to meet the quota. That was always the problem or one of the problems in Congo, for example. And one of the realities is that the United States is the only country with the logistical, intelligence, et cetera, infrastructure to do these operations. They really are, they're not sustainable without U.S. assistance. And that's, maybe I'll just close on this little story, which I think should make you feel better about your country. In the Iraq negotiations, a number of us were recommending that we use this fact I was just talking to with respect to another permanent member that was engaging in peacekeeping operation. And say, that's peacekeeping operations is important to you, Iraq's important to us, for heaven's sake, let's do a deal. And in the Pentagon, for example, I was told, no, they're saving lives, we can't do that.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.